Out in the territories, the land doesn't keep secrets. It buries them. Under a sun that shows no mercy, a man can ride for days and see nothing but the ghosts of what used to be. But on a day hot enough to melt a pistol rancher, Jedediah Stone found something the desert hadn't claimed yet. A woman walking like a phantom with a hole in her gut and a story in her eyes that could get them both killed. He didn't know her name or the devils chasing her. He only knew one thing: you don't leave a soul to die in the dust. That simple act of mercy would ignite a fire that threatened to burn his entire world to the ground. The sun was a merciless hammer on the anvil of the Arizona Territory. It beat down on Jedediah Stone, searing the back of his neck and bleaching the already faded blue of his work shirt. The land around his Stone's Throw ranch was cracked and thirsty, the very air shimmering with a heat that promised no relief. For 3 days, he'd been tracking a stray longhorn, a stubborn brindle that had broken through a weak spot in the northern fence line. It was tedious, soul-grinding work, the kind that left a man talking to his horse just to hear a voice that wasn't the whisper of the wind. His horse, a tough buckskin named Cinder, let out a low nicker ears, swiveling forward. Jed pulled on the reins, his eyes narrowed against the glare following the horse's gaze. At first, he saw nothing but the monotonous landscape of scrub brush, rock, and dust. Then a flicker of movement. It wasn't the darting of a lizard or the slow crawl of a Gila monster. It was upright, human. A figure impossibly frail was stumbling through the heat haze a quarter-mile east near the dried-up bed of Coyote Creek. They were moving with a strange, lurching gait, like a puppet with its strings tangled. No horse, no water canteen in sight. Suicide. Or something worse. Jed grunted, turning Cinder's head. "Well, old boy," he murmured, his voice raspy from disuse. "Looks like our brindle will have to wait." As he drew closer, the figure resolved into a woman. Her dress, once perhaps a respectable calico, was torn, filthy, and stained with something dark around the waist. Her bonnet was gone, and her hair, a cascade of dark chestnut, was matted with dirt and burrs. She wasn't walking so much as she was being pushed forward by some unseen force of will, each step a staggering, painful effort. He spurred Cinder into a gentle trot, calling out when he was 50 yards away. "Mom, you all right out there?" She didn't respond. She didn't even seem to hear him. Her head was bowed, her focus entirely on the impossible task of putting one foot in front of the other. Jed dismounted, the soft thud of his boots on the parched earth, seeming loud in the oppressive silence. He approached slowly, his hand resting near the butt of his Colt, a habit born of long years in a land that was beautiful, but never ever safe. "Mom," he said again, his voice softer now. It was then that she stumbled, her legs finally giving out. She crumpled to the ground in a heap of fabric and dust. Jed ran the last few feet kneeling beside her. He gently turned her over, and his breath caught in his throat. Her face was pale as bone. Beneath the grime, her lips cracked and blue. But it was the stain on her dress that held his attention. It wasn't just dirt. It was a dark, ugly bloom of dried and fresh blood centered on her abdomen. He carefully pushed aside a tear in the fabric. There, just above her hip, was a puckered, angry-looking bullet hole. It was a gut shot. A slow, agonizing death sentence out here. Her eyes fluttered open. They were a startling, intelligent blue, now clouded with pain and a deep, primal fear. A single word escaped her lips, a sound no louder than a sighing reed. Water. All thoughts of the stray longhorn, the broken fence, the solitude he cherished, they evaporated like a raindrop on a hot skillet. He looked at her dying under the brutal sun, and then he looked west toward the thin line of cottonwoods that marked the only reliable water source for miles his own well. Without a second thought, he holstered the canteen from his belt and uncorked it, lifting her head gently. "Just a little now." He coached his voice, a low rumble. "Easy." He let a trickle of the precious water moisten her lips, then a little more. She drank with a desperate, weak thirst that was painful to watch. He knew she couldn't walk. He knew Cinder couldn't carry them both for the 2 hours it would take to get back to the ranch house. And he knew with a certainty that settled cold in his gut that leaving her here to fetch a wagon was the same as leaving her for the buzzards. Jedediah Stone stood up, his jaw set. He was not a young man anymore. The years had settled into his bones, and his back ached on cold mornings. But he was strong, his muscles hardened by a lifetime of ranch work. He looked down at the woman, a complete stranger, who was bleeding out her life onto the baked Arizona dirt. There was no choice to be made. There was only what a man had to do. He slid his arms carefully beneath her, one under her back, the other under her knees. With a grunt that was half effort, half prayer, he lifted her. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight against his chest. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and a soft, pained whimper escaped her. "Easy now," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "I've got you." He turned and began to walk. Each step was a deliberate act of will. The sun beat down. The dust kicked up into his face, and in his arms he carried the dying woman, a piece of violent, unknown trouble toward the one thing that could save her water. The weight in his arms was more than just flesh and bone. It was a promise. And Jedediah Stone was a man who kept his promises, even the ones he made to himself, in the unforgiving silence of the desert. The ranch was a long way off, and the shadows were already beginning to lengthen, promising a cold, dangerous night. The journey back was a waking nightmare. The sun finally sank, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple, but offering no respite. The desert merely traded its scorching heat for a deceptive chill. Jed's shoulders screamed, his legs burned, and every jarring step seemed to pull a fresh gasp of pain from the woman in his arms. He spoke to her in a low, steady murmur, the words meaningless, the tone everything. He told her about Cinder, about the stubbornness of his cattle, about the way the light hit the mesas in the morning. He spoke of anything to fill the silence, to keep the encroaching darkness, both literal and metaphorical, at bay. By the time the familiar silhouette of his ranch house appeared against the star-dusted sky, Jed was running on fumes. The simple 2-room structure built of sturdy timber he'd cut and hauled himself had never looked more like a fortress. His other hand, a quiet, wiry man of 50 named Miguel, was waiting on the porch, a lantern held high. His weathered face, usually calm as a still pond, was a mask of concern. "Madre de Dios, Jedediah," Miguel breathed, hurrying down the steps. "What have you found?" "Trouble." Jed grunted, his voice a raw rasp. "Get the door, boil water, and bring my medical kit from the chest. The laudanum, too." Miguel, a man of few questions and decisive action, did as he was told. They carried her inside, laying her gently on Jed's own cot, the only proper bed in the house. In the warm, flickering lamplight, the severity of her situation was starkly clear. Her breathing was shallow, and a feverish heat was already radiating from her skin. For the next 2 hours, the ranch house transformed into a makeshift infirmary. Miguel worked with a quiet efficiency that Jed had always been grateful for, preparing clean rags and hot water. Jed, his hands, surprisingly steady, got to work. He cut away the blood-caked fabric of her dress, his movements careful and impersonal. The bullet had gone in clean, but there was no exit wound. It was still inside her, a leaden seed of death. "I can't get it out, Miguel," Jed said, his voice low and tight with frustration. "It's too deep. I'll kill her trying. All we can do is clean the wound and pray it doesn't fester." He cleaned the entry point with carbolic acid, earning a sharp, piercing cry from the woman who thrashed weakly on the cot. He poured a measure of laudanum and water between her lips, hoping to grant her the mercy of oblivion. Then he packed the wound with clean gauze and bound her midsection tightly. It was a crude, desperate act of medicine, and they both knew it. Her life was now in the hands of God and the strength of her own constitution. Jed finally slumped into a chair by the hearth, the adrenaline leaving him feeling hollowed out. Miguel placed a cup of coffee, black and strong, into his hands. "Who do you think she is?" Miguel asked, his gaze fixed on the unconscious woman. "Don't know. Don't want to know," Jed replied, though it was a lie. He was consumed by the question. Someone shot her and left her for dead. That kind of person doesn't give up easy. They'll come looking to finish the job. "So we have brought the wolf to our door," Miguel stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "We brought a wounded lamb," Jed corrected quietly. The wolves were already out there. For the next 3 days, the woman drifted in a feverish twilight. She was a ghost in his house, her presence a constant low-grade hum of anxiety. Jed and Miguel took turns sitting with her, forcing sips of broth and water past her lips, changing the dressings on a wound that grew angrier and more inflamed with each passing hour. In her delirium, she whispered. The words were fragmented, broken pieces of a puzzle Jed couldn't solve. Names tumbled from her lips in a fevered rush. "Elias! No, please!" She would plead to an unseen tormentor. Other times she spoke with a chilling clarity. "The ledger. He doesn't know I have the ledger." And once, in a moment that sent a chill down Jed's spine, she cried out, "Blackwood will kill us all, Elias Blackwood." The name was poison in this territory. Blackwood was a cattle baron from the north, a man who had built an empire on ambition, ruthlessness, and the unmarked graves of those who stood in his way. He owned politicians, had the sheriff in his pocket, and commanded a small army of hired guns who were more loyal to his coin than to any law. If this woman had crossed Elias Blackwood, she hadn't just been shot. She had been marked for erasure from the face of the earth. And now so had Jedediah Stone and his quiet little ranch. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. Jed was sitting by her cot, cleaning a rifle, when her eyes opened. The delirious fog was gone. They were clear, sharp, and filled with a terror that was absolute. She tried to sit up, a strangled cry escaping her as the movement sent a bolt of white-hot agony through her gut. "Easy now," Jed said, putting the rifle aside and moving to her side. "You're safe here. Just lay still." Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the rough-hewn walls, the stone fireplace, the man with the weary, sun-creased face looking down at her. Panic tightened her features. "Where am I? Who are you?" she demanded, her voice a weak, scratchy thing. "Name's Jedediah Stone. This is my ranch. I found you out by the creek bed 4 days ago." Her hand went instinctively to her stomach, her fingers flinching as they brushed against the thick bandages. The memory, the horror of it, flooded back into her face. "He shot me," she whispered. "Fletcher. He shot me and left me." Fletcher. Jed knew that name too. Caspian Fletcher. Blackwood's top man, a cold-blooded enforcer with a reputation for efficiency and cruelty. "You need to rest," Jed said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We can talk later." "No," she insisted, her voice gaining a desperate strength. "You don't understand. They'll be looking for me. If they find me here, they'll kill you too. You have to let me go." Jed looked at her, this woman, who was still halfway to the grave, trying to run from a man like Elias Blackwood. He saw the terror in her eyes, but beneath it he saw a flicker of something else, a hard, defiant spark. It was the same spark he'd seen in a cornered coyote, the one that says it will chew its own leg off to get out of a trap. "First," he said, his voice a low, unyielding baritone, "you're going to tell me your name. Second, you're not going anywhere until you can stand on your own 2 feet. This is my home. The wolves might be out there, but they're not coming through my door without a fight." She stared at him, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. A fragile, unspoken truce hung in the air between them. The stranger in his bed, the bringer of Blackwood's wrath, finally gave him the first piece of the puzzle. "Ilara," she whispered. "My name is Ilara Vance." The days that followed were a quiet, tense dance of recovery and mistrust. Ilara Vance was a difficult patient. She fought sleep, as if afraid of the nightmares that waited for her there. She ate the thin broth Miguel prepared only when Jed stood over her, his expression immovable. Every creak of the floorboards made her jump her eyes, darting to the door. Her body tensing for a fight or flight she was in no condition to attempt. Jed gave her space. He and Miguel went about their daily chores, the familiar rhythm of ranch life, a stark contrast to the coiled tension inside the house. Yet Jed was always aware of her. He'd catch her watching him from the cot as he repaired a piece of tack, her blue eyes, analytical searching. She was trying to measure him to understand the man who had inexplicably saved her. One afternoon, a week after he'd found her, he came inside to see her sitting up on the edge of the cot, her face pale and beaded with sweat from the effort. It was the first time she'd done so on her own. "Shouldn't be doing that," he said, his voice gruffer than he intended. "I can't just lie here forever," she retorted, her voice still weak but laced with defiance. "A body that doesn't move is a body that's waiting to die." He didn't argue. Instead, he pulled up a stool. "Then talk to me, Ilara. Tell me what I'm up against. Tell me why Elias Blackwood wants you dead." She looked down at her hands, twisting a loose thread on the blanket he'd given her. "It's better if you don't know." "I pulled a woman with a bullet in her gut off Blackwood's land," Jed said, his voice low and patient. "I think it's a little late for better if I don't know. His shadow is already on this place. I want to know how big it is." She was silent for a long time. The only sound was the buzzing of a fly against the window pane. Finally she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "My late husband, Thomas Vance, was Blackwood's business partner. Or so I thought. After Thomas died of a fever last year, I discovered what he really was, Blackwood's bookkeeper. His record keeper. She took a shaky breath. "Blackwood is stealing this land, not just buying it. He's diverting water from smaller ranches until they dry up and have to sell for pennies on the dollar. He has his men rustle cattle, then offers to buy the unprofitable ranch. Anyone who refuses, they have accidents, fires, rock slides. Thomas kept a record of it all, a separate ledger. Dates names, payments to men like Fletcher, and even to Sheriff Brody in the town of Redemption." Jed's jaw tightened. He'd long suspected Sheriff Brody was a man for hire, but hearing it confirmed sent a cold dread through him. "Thomas was a weak man, but not an evil one," Ilara continued. "He was terrified of Blackwood, but he kept the ledger as insurance. An anchor to his own soul, I suppose. When he died, I found it. I was going to take it to the territorial marshal in Prescott. I thought I could just disappear. But Blackwood must have suspected something. He sent Fletcher to escort me to his main residence for my own safety. I knew it was a lie. I ran. Fletcher caught up with me at the creek. Her hand unconsciously went to her side. He took my horse and my bag. He thought he'd found the ledger. But I... A small, grim smile touched her lips for the first time. I wasn't foolish enough to keep it in my luggage. He shot me and left me confident his problem was solved. So you don't have it. Jed stated, a small measure of relief in his voice. Ilara's blue eyes met his, and the defiant spark was back, burning brighter now. Oh, I have it, she said quietly. He didn't find the right bag. She gestured with her head toward a small, grimy leather satchel on the floor near the cot, a pouch Jed had assumed held little more than female trinkets. It's all in there, the proof to hang Elias Blackwood and every man on his payroll. The air in the room grew heavy. This changed everything. She wasn't just a witness, she was the evidence. She was the fuse to a powder keg that could blow the entire county apart. A fragile trust began to grow in the space her confession created. She started eating more, asking Miguel about his life in Mexico before he came north. She watched Jed work with his hands, the quiet competence with which he fixed anything that was broken. She saw the way he treated his animals with a firm but gentle respect. He was a man rooted to his land, a man of substance and principle so different from the viper's nest she had escaped. Jed in turn saw beyond the terrified victim. He saw a woman of intelligence and courage. Her speech was educated, her bearing refined, even in her current state. She had survived a world of wealth and deceit, and had the iron will to try and burn it down. He found himself admiring her, a feeling that was as unfamiliar as it was unsettling. The first sign of the outside world intruding came 2 weeks after her arrival. Jed was on the porch, mending a bridle, when he saw a plume of dust on the horizon. It wasn't the lazy drift of a lone rider. It was 3 men riding at a steady pace, coming straight for the ranch. He stood up, his body going still. Ilara appeared in the doorway behind him, leaning on the frame for support. The color had drained from her face. "It's them," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Get inside," Jed commanded, his voice sharp, "and stay away from the window. Miguel," he called out towards the barn. Miguel emerged, wiping his hands on a rag, his eyes already on the approaching riders. He simply nodded, then disappeared back into the barn. A moment later, Jed heard the faint, metallic click of a rifle action. Jedediah Stone did not reach for his own gun. He stood his ground on the porch, his hands loose at his sides, his face a stony, unreadable mask. He had faced down charging bulls, rattlesnakes, and flash floods. He would face this the same way. He would not show fear on his own land. He watched the riders draw closer, 3 dark shapes against the blistering sky, bringing the shadow of Elias Blackwood right to his front door. The 3 riders pulled up 20 yards from the porch, their horses kicking up a cloud of fine dust that settled over everything like a shroud. The man in the middle was Caspian Fletcher. He was exactly as Jed had pictured him, tall and lean in the saddle, dressed in a black duster that seemed to absorb the sunlight. His face was all sharp angles and predatory stillness, with pale, watchful eyes that missed nothing. The men flanking him were boilerplate hired guns, their faces hard and empty. "That's close enough," Jed called out, his voice calm and even carrying easily in the still air. He didn't move from his spot, a silent sentinel guarding his home. Fletcher's thin lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Just paying a neighborly visit," he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "Name's Fletcher. I'm the foreman for Mr. Blackwood up at the Obsidian Rim." "I know who you are," Jed replied. "This is the Stone's Throw. We're not neighbors. You're a long way from your own range." Fletcher's gaze swept over the ranch, the solid house, the well-kept barn, the sturdy corral. It was the look of a wolf assessing a sheep pen. Mr. Blackwood is a man who believes in a wide community. We're looking for a stray. A woman. Been missing a couple of weeks now. The wife of his late partner, Mrs. Vance. Frail thing, not in her right mind. Wandered off. We're all terribly concerned. The lie was so bald, so audacious, it was almost impressive. Jed kept his face, impassive. Haven't seen anyone. This is a big country, easy to get lost in. True. Fletcher conceded, his eyes locking onto Jed's. But things have a way of turning up, especially when there's a reward. Mr. Blackwood is offering $500 for information, leading to her safe return. A man could do a lot with that kind of money. The offer hung in the air, a poisoned fruit. It was a test, a bribe, and a threat wrapped in one. $500 was a fortune enough to buy a new herd to hire on a half-dozen hands. It was also enough to get a man killed for asking the wrong questions. "I'm not in need of his money," Jed said flatly. "If I see a woman wandering, I'll do what's right. Give her water and point her toward the town of redemption." One of the men beside Fletcher shifted in his saddle. "Sheriff Brody is helping with the search himself," the man chimed in a little too eagerly. "He's the one who suggested we check the outlying homesteads. Said you were a man who kept to himself, the kind of place someone might hide." The mention of the sheriff was a deliberate chess move, meant to remind Jed that the law was not on his side. It meant there was no one to run to. "Sheriff Brody knows I don't invite trouble to my door," Jed said, his voice hardening slightly. "And I don't appreciate it being brought here either." For a long moment, nobody spoke. The tension was a physical thing, a tightening in the air. Jed could feel Ilara's presence behind the door, could almost hear the frantic beating of her heart. He was acutely aware of Miguel in the barn, the rifle, a silent promise of support. Fletcher's pale eyes bored into him, searching for a crack, a flicker of fear or deception. Jed gave him nothing but granite. Finally, Fletcher gathered his reins. "Well, we won't take up any more of your valuable time, Mr. Stone. But keep an eye out. She's a slip of a thing. Dark hair, blue eyes. Answers to the name Ilara." He said her name deliberately, watching Jed's face for any reaction. Jed remained motionless. "If you see her," Fletcher continued, his voice dropping to a confidential, menacing purr, "you send word to us. It would be unhealthy for anyone to get the idea of sheltering her. Mr. Blackwood considers it a private family matter. He doesn't like outsiders meddling in his family." With a final lingering look that was a clear promise of future violence, Fletcher wheeled his horse around. His two men followed suit. They trotted away their departure as sudden as their arrival, leaving only the settling dust and a thick, suffocating sense of dread behind. Jed waited until they were distant figures on the horizon before he let out a slow, controlled breath. The door creaked open behind him. Ilara emerged, her face as white as a sheet. She was leaning heavily on the doorframe, her knuckles white. "They know!" She breathed, her voice filled with terror. "They don't know for sure, but they suspect. They'll be back." "Yes, they will," Jed agreed, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. He turned to face her, his expression grim. He was testing the fences. Now he knows where they are, he'll be planning how to tear them down. That night, the atmosphere in the small house was heavy with unspoken fears. The fragile peace they had built was shattered. The enemy had a name, a face, and he had been to their door. They were no longer just hiding. They were a target. Jed sat by the low fire, oiling his Winchester rifle, the rhythmic slide and click of the action, a counterpoint to the chirping crickets outside. Ilara watched him, her fear warring with a growing sense of guilt. "This is my fault, Jedediah," she said softly. I've brought this down on you and Miguel. You should have left me in the desert." Jed stopped his work, looking at her across the flickering firelight. "I found you wandering with a bullet in your gut," he said, his voice a low rumble. "This trouble was yours long before it was mine. A man doesn't get to choose when to be decent. He just does it. Now the only choice we have is how we face what's coming." He looked at the rifle in his hands, then at her, and finally at the ledger that sat on the small table between them, its leather cover seeming to absorb the light from the room. It was more than a book of numbers. It was a death warrant. And Fletcher's visit had been the official notice of its signing. The shadow of Blackwood had fallen upon them, and Jed knew, with the chilling certainty of a winter frost, that the only way to get out from under it was to fight. The days after Fletcher's visit were cloaked in a new kind of silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of solitude Jed was used to, but a watchful, listening silence. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats, every hawk's cry like a human whistle. Jed started carrying his rifle with him, everywhere, even just to go from the house to the barn. Miguel took to watching the horizon from the hayloft, his old Sharps rifle resting beside him. They were a small island in a vast, hostile sea. Elara, now strong enough to move about the house for longer periods, did what she could. She mended their clothes, organized their supplies, and read from the ledger until her eyes were sore, memorizing names and figures, trying to arm herself with knowledge. The document was her shield and her sword, but it felt impossibly flimsy against the threat of men like Fletcher. Jed knew they couldn't just wait for the axe to fall. Blackwood wasn't a man who made idle threats. The visit was the warning. The attack would be the follow-through. He began to assess his own defenses. His ranch was isolated, which was both a blessing and a curse. No close neighbors meant no one to call on for help, but it also meant no one for Blackwood's men to easily question or intimidate. The problem was, his operation was small. Besides himself and Miguel, he only had two other hands, a young, eager kid named Billy O'Connell, barely 19, and a seasoned, cynical drifter named Silas Kane, who had been with him for nearly a year. They lived in the bunkhouse, a separate, smaller building, about 100 yards from the main house. Jed trusted Miguel with his life. Billy was a good kid, if a little naive. But Silas was a closed book, a hard worker, yes, but there was a bitterness in him, a resentment for the world that had never given him an easy ride. He was a man who watched everything and said little, his eyes holding a permanent, calculating squint. One evening, Jed called the two hands to the main house. He kept it simple. "We've had a visitor," he told them, his eyes on Silas. "A foreman from the Obsidian Rim. Seems Mr. Blackwood is looking for someone. Things might get tense around here for a while. I want everyone to keep their eyes open. Report anything unusual." Billy's face showed open concern. "Trouble, boss. You want us to stand with you. I want you to do your jobs and be watchful," Jed said, his gaze unwavering. Silas just spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Blackwood's a big dog," he grunted. "Not wise to get in his way." It wasn't a threat, but it wasn't a promise of loyalty either. The next day, Jed's suspicion began to solidify. He was reshoeing Cinder in the barn when he saw Silas talking to Billy down by the corral. It was the way Silas was talking that caught Jed's attention, leaning in, close his hand on the boy's shoulder, his expression a mixture of persuasion and veiled threat. Billy looked uncomfortable, shaking his head. Silas said something else, sharp and low, and then walked away, leaving the boy looking troubled. Later, Jed approached Billy. "Everything all right, kid?" Billy jumped, startled. "Yeah, sure, Jed. Everything's fine." He wouldn't meet Jed's eye. "Silas seemed a bit talkative today." Jed pressed gently. Billy swallowed hard. He was just asking questions about the woman. He heard me and Miguel talking, asked if she was still here, how she was doing. Said a man could make a fortune helping Blackwood find what he's lost. The blood in Jed's veins went cold. Silas wasn't just curious. He was probing for information. He was a snake in their woodpile, waiting for the right moment to strike. The confirmation came that night. A storm was rolling in the sky, a bruised purple, the air thick with the smell of rain. Jed told Ilara he was doing a final check on the livestock. Instead, he circled around to the back of the bunkhouse, staying in the deepening shadows. Through the single dirty window he could see Silas at the small table. He wasn't cleaning his gun or playing solitaire. He had a piece of paper and a pencil stub, and he was writing, his lips moving as he carefully formed the words. After a moment, he folded the paper, tucked it into his boot, and headed for the door. Jed melted back into the shadows behind the water trough. Silas emerged, looked around furtively, then began walking not toward the house or the barn, but toward the far southern fence line, the direction that led to the town of Redemption. He was going to leave a message, or meet someone. Jed didn't follow. He didn't need to. He had seen enough. He returned to the house, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. Betrayal was a bitter pill far worse than an open enemy. Ilara saw the look on his face the moment he stepped inside. "What is it?" "It's Silas." Jed said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "He's the leak." A new wave of fear washed over her. "What are we going to do?" Jed bolted the door and walked over to the table where the ledger lay. He placed his hand on it. For weeks it had been a symbol of danger, a curse she'd brought to his door. Now its nature had changed. "Fletcher thinks he's hunting a helpless woman," Jed said, his eyes meeting hers across the table. The lamplight carved deep lines into his face. "Blackwood thinks he can scare me off my own land with a few hired guns and a bought sheriff. And Silas thinks he can sell us out for a handful of silver." He paused, a grim resolve settling over him. "They're all wrong. This ledger isn't just evidence anymore, Ilara. It's bait. And I'm done waiting for the wolves to come to me. We're going to set a trap." He knew it was a desperate gamble. A rancher, a quiet Mexican hand, and a wounded woman against a cattle baron's private army. But Jedediah Stone's back was against the wall on his own land, defending a principle he valued more than his own life. The time for hiding was over. The storm was breaking outside, the first drops of rain beginning to patter against the roof. It was a fitting sound. The real storm was yet to come. The rain fell for 2 days, a relentless grey sheet that turned the ranch into a sea of mud. The storm mirrored the one brewing inside the small house. With Silas's betrayal confirmed, the game had changed. They were no longer defending. They were preparing to attack, to use Blackwood's own arrogance against him. "He'll send Fletcher," Jed explained, pacing the floor while Ilara and Miguel listened. "He won't come himself, not at first. He'll want the ledger, and he'll want you, Ilara. He'll want it to be quiet. But Silas will have told them our numbers, just 3 of us they need to worry about. They'll come expecting to walk right over us." "They will be wrong," Miguel said, his hand resting on the stock of his sharps. It was the most emotion Jed had seen from him in weeks. The plan they hatched was born of desperation and an intimate knowledge of the land. Jed's ranch was backed by a series of rocky maze-like canyons known as the Devil's Jaw. It was treacherous terrain, easy to get into, but nearly impossible to get out of if you didn't know the way. "We won't fight them here at the house," Jed declared, pointing to a hand-drawn map on the table. "It's too open. We make our stand at the mouth of the West Canyon here. It creates a bottleneck. They can't bring their numbers to bear all at once. The first order of business was Silas. They couldn't let him ride out and give away their plan. The next morning, as Silas headed for the stables, Jed and Miguel were waiting for him. "Morning, Silas." Jed said, his voice mild. His Winchester was held loosely in his hands, but the barrel was pointing in Silas's general direction. Miguel stood off to the side, silent and watchful. Silas froze his eyes, darting between the two men. A flicker of panic crossed his face before being replaced by his usual sullen mask. "Boss." "Going for a ride?" Jed asked. "Got a message to deliver." He reached into his own pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a blank one he'd prepared. "I found this near the south fence. Looks like you dropped it." The bluff worked. The blood drained from Silas's face. He knew he was caught. I don't know what you're talking about." "Save it," Jed cut in his voice, turning to Steele. "You sold us out. For how much? A few $100 from a man who'd put a bullet in your back as soon as look at you." Silas's resentment finally boiled over. "You talk about decency and principles," he spat. "But what's it get you, a dusty patch of land and an early grave? Blackwood owns this territory. A smart man gets on the winning side." "A smart man knows the difference between a winning side and a snake pit," Jed retorted. He nodded to Miguel. "Tie him up. We'll keep him in the root cellar. He can listen to the battle he helped start." With the traitor neutralized, they spent the next 36 hours in a fever of preparation. It was a grim, methodical process. They hauled supplies up to the canyon, mouth boxes of ammunition, canteens of water, and sacks of grain for the horses which they would tether in a hidden alcove. Jed and Miguel used shovels and their bare hands to build up low rock walls in key positions, creating fortified nests from which they could fire. Elara refused to be left behind. Though still not at full strength, she insisted on helping. Her hands, clearly unused to such labor, were rubbed raw as she helped load rifles and pack medical supplies. "I can shoot," she told Jed, her jaw set with determination. She picked up a spare Colt revolver from his weapons chest, her grip surprisingly steady. "My father taught me. I won't hide while you fight a war that I started." Jed looked at her at the fire in her eyes and saw not the fragile victim he'd carried from the desert, but a formidable ally. He nodded slowly. "All right. You'll take the high position up there." He pointed to a ledge that overlooked the canyon entrance. "It's protected from the front. You'll be our eyes, and you'll only shoot if they get past us." "Understood." "Understood," she said, her voice firm. On the final night, a strange calm settled over them. They sat around the table in the ranch house, the ledger sitting in the center like a holy relic. They were about to risk everything, their lives, their home, for what was written in its pages. "I never asked for this," Jed said into the silence, looking at the flickering lamp. "All I ever wanted was this piece of land, and to be left alone." "The world doesn't always care what we want," Elara replied softly. She reached across the table, her hand resting near his. It was the first time she had initiated any physical contact. "You are a good man, Jedediah Stone. Thomas used to talk about men like you, men of honor. He said they were a dying breed." "Honor doesn't stop bullets," Jed grumbled, but he didn't pull his hand away. "No," she agreed, "but it's what makes you stand in front of them." They left before dawn. Under the cloak of pre-dawn darkness, they led the horses up the winding trail to the Devil's Jaw. Billy O'Connell, who had been horrified to learn of Silas's betrayal, was tasked with a crucial, dangerous role. He would stay behind, hidden. Once Fletcher and his men rode past the ranch and into the canyon, Billy was to take the fastest horse and ride like the wind, not to the town of Redemption, but south to Fort Grant, a 2-day ride. He carried a letter from Ilara and a single damning page carefully removed from the ledger, addressed to the U.S. Army commander. It was their only hope if they failed. As the first rays of sun painted the eastern sky, they were in position. Jed was nestled behind a rock wall on the left side of the canyon mouth. Miguel was on the right, his Sharps rifle resting on a boulder, its long barrel glinting in the new light. High above them, Ilara was concealed on the ledge, a rifle and the revolver at her side. They were ready. All they had to do now was wait. The silence of the canyon was absolute, broken only by the wind whistling through the rocks. It was the deep, profound silence that comes just before a storm. They watched the entrance to their trap, knowing that Blackwood's men were coming, bringing hell with them. The sun climbed higher, baking the rocks, and turning the canyon floor into a furnace. The waiting was its own form of torture. Every shadow seemed to move. Every lizard skittering across a rock sounded like a boot step. Then around mid-morning, Miguel gave a low whistle. A dust cloud, thick and purposeful, was rising from the valley below. It was them. Jed chambered around in his Winchester, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet. He took a slow breath, the air hot and dry in his lungs. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, a steady, powerful drumbeat of adrenaline. This was it. The moment where everything would be won or lost. They came into view soon after. It was worse than Jed had anticipated. Not 3 or 4 men. It was Fletcher leading a group of 8 riders. 9 men in total. 9 hired guns, confident, arrogant, riding into a trap they couldn't see. They rode with a loose formation, rifles in their scabbards, expecting nothing more than a simple snatch and grab. Silas's information had made them careless. From her vantage point, Ilara watched them approach. Her hands were slick with sweat on the stock of the rifle. She saw Fletcher at the lead, his black duster, making him a stark target. These were the men who had left her to die. There was no room for fear now. It had been burned out of her, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. The riders entered the narrow mouth of the canyon. The high rock walls on either side funneled them together, forcing them into a tighter group. Jed let them get another 50 yards, in just past a large, distinctive outcrop of red rock he had designated as the kill zone. He raised his Winchester to his shoulder, took aim at the lead rider, not Fletcher, but the man to his right, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle shot shattered the silence, echoing off the canyon walls like a thunderclap. The rider was thrown from his saddle, as if struck by an invisible fist, landing in a heap in the dust. Before the outlaws could even react, the big Sharps rifle boomed from the other side of the canyon. Miguel's shot was perfect. Another rider tumbled from his horse. Chaos erupted. The outlaws scrambled for cover, pulling their rifles, their horses, rearing and screaming in panic. They had ridden into a hornet's nest. Up there on the ridges, Fletcher roared, his voice cutting through the gunfire. He was smart, quickly realizing they were caught in a crossfire. He and 2 others dove behind a cluster of boulders, while the others returned fire wildly, their bullets ricocheting off the rocks around Jed and Miguel. The battle became a deadly symphony of sound and fury. The roar of the Sharps, the steady crack of Jed's Winchester, the answering bark of the outlaws' Colts and repeaters. Gunsmoke filled the air, acrid and biting. Jed worked with a calm, deadly efficiency. He was no gunslinger, but he was a masterful hunter. He didn't waste shots. He waited for a man to expose himself, a hat to appear over a rock, a shoulder to become visible, and then he fired. Miguel was a rock. His heavy-caliber Sharps was slower to load, but each shot was devastating. He took out a 3rd man who was trying to flank their position, the powerful rifle sending him spinning. But Blackwood's men were seasoned killers. Under Fletcher's direction, they began to lay down suppressing fire, pinning Jed and Miguel down. Two of them started to work their way up the rocky scree on Jed's side, trying to get a better angle. Jed saw them coming. He was trapped. For every shot he took at the climbers, he was exposed to the men below. A bullet kicked up dirt just inches from his face. Another splintered the rock near his head. High above, Ilara saw his predicament. This was her moment. Her heart pounded, but her hands were steady. She remembered her father's words from years ago. Breathe, aim, squeeze. Don't pull. She rested the rifle on the edge of the ledge, sighted on the higher of the two climbing men, and fired. The shot was high, missing him, but it struck the rock wall beside his head, sending stone fragments into his face. He cried out, losing his footing and sliding back down several feet. His partner, startled by the unexpected shot from above, looked up. It was all the opening Jed needed. He swiveled, aimed, and fired. The second climber crumpled and fell. The first man, now exposed and alone, panicked. He scrambled back down toward Fletcher's position. The tide was turning. They had lost 4 men, nearly half their number, and the element of surprise was now firmly against them. Fletcher was furious. He had been outmaneuvered. He screamed at his remaining men. "It's the woman, she's up there. Get her." 2 men broke cover and started firing up at Ilara's position. Bullets whined past her, chipping away at the rock she was hiding behind. She ducked down, her heart racing. She was pinned. Seeing Ilara drawing fire, Jed knew he had to do something drastic. He looked at Miguel across the canyon and gave a sharp, prearranged signal, a 2-fingered wave. Miguel nodded in understanding. He began to lay down a slow, steady covering fire on Fletcher's position, forcing them to keep their heads down. Under the cover of Miguel's shots, Jed did the unthinkable. He abandoned his fortified position. Keeping low, he scrambled back from the ledge deeper into the rocks and began making his way through a narrow crevice he knew well. It was a goat path, dangerous and steep, but it would bring him out on the canyon floor behind the remaining outlaws. The gunfire dwindled as Jed moved. Ilara stayed hidden. Fletcher, thinking he had the upper hand, made his move. "They're running out of bullets," he yelled. "Forward, rush them." He and the 3 remaining men burst from their cover, charging toward Miguel's position. But as they ran past the red rock outcrop, Jed emerged from the crevice behind them. "Fletcher!" he yelled. Blackwood's foreman spun around his face, a mask of shock and rage. He brought his pistol up, but he was too late. Jed fired the Winchester from his hip. The shot caught Fletcher square in the chest, stopping his charge cold. He looked down at the blossoming red stain on his duster, a look of disbelief on his face, before he fell to his knees and then pitched forward into the dust. The remaining 3 outlaws froze in horror. They were caught between Miguel in front and Jed behind. It was over. One threw his gun down immediately. The other 2 hesitated, and Miguel's sharps roared one last time. Another man fell. The last one, seeing his chances, threw his hands in the air. Silence descended upon the canyon, thick and heavy, smelling of gunpowder and death. It was done. Jed stood there, his rifle smoking his body, trembling from the adrenaline. He looked at the carnage, the price of their freedom, written in blood on the canyon floor. Miguel slowly walked out from his position, his face grim. A moment later, they saw Ilara carefully making her way down from the high ledge. She ran the last few feet to Jed, her face streaked with grime and tears. She didn't say a word. She just stopped in front of him, looking from him to the fallen men, her expression a mixture of shock, relief, and horror. "It's over," Jed said, his voice raspy. "No," she whispered, looking past him toward the north. "It's not. This was just his arm. We still have to face the man himself." She was right. Elias Blackwood was still out there. But they had survived. They had the ledger. and Billy O'Connell was riding for the army. For the first time, there was a glimmer of hope on the horizon, a fragile dawn breaking after a long, violent night. They had faced the storm, and against all odds, they were still standing. In the end, the story of Jedediah Stone and Alara Vance wasn't just about a gunfight in a canyon. It's a testament to the fact that even in the most lawless of places, the choices of a few good people can change everything. The arrival of the U.S. Army, prompted by Billy's desperate ride, and the undeniable proof in the ledger, brought a final definitive end to Elias Blackwood's reign of terror. The land began to heal, and so did the people. Jedediah never sought to be a hero. He was just a rancher who stopped to help a stranger. Alara wasn't looking for a war. She was just trying to survive. But together, they found in each other the courage to stand against the darkness. Their story reminds us that honor and decency aren't just words from a bygone era. They are actions. They are choices. And sometimes the most profound choice is to simply stop and offer a hand to someone who has fallen. If their story of courage and resilience moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves a true tale of the Old West, and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss a journey back in time with us. Thank you for listening.